There are moments in history when a quiet shift happens before anyone is ready to admit it. Not a loud revolution, not a dramatic collapse all at once, but a slow withdrawal that changes everything beneath the surface. What we are witnessing right now is one of those moments, and most people are still trying to explain it away with excuses instead of facing what it really means. If you stay until the end of this video, you will understand why what is happening in China is not just a cultural story, not just an economic story, but a warning about what happens when one side of society pushes too far and assumes the other side will never leave. Before we go any further, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and you want to get every single video the moment we release it. That support helps this channel grow and ensures these conversations continue. Also, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, Angry's Crypto Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly and intelligently. It is built for people who understand that the world is changing and who want to be prepared rather than caught off guard. So go check it out now using the link below. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and you want to show support for the work that goes into them, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to help keep the lights on and the content coming. Now, let us talk about what is really happening. What we are seeing unfold in China right now is not a sudden event. It did not appear overnight and it did not happen by accident. It is the end result of years of social pressure, economic imbalance, and a relationship dynamic that was never sustainable in the first place. For a long time, a large portion of men in China were expected to carry the financial burden of dating, relationships, and even basic daily survival for women, often with very little in return beyond the hope of approval or attention. This expectation was normalized, encouraged, and even mocked when men questioned it. Men were told that this was simply how things worked, that this was the price of participation, and that if they did not like it, they were the problem. For years, many men complied. They worked longer hours, spent more money, and delayed their own goals. They paid for meals, paid for rent, paid for gifts, paid for holidays, and paid for lifestyles that were not their own. They were told this was romantic. They were told this was necessary. They were told that the sacrifice would eventually be rewarded. But over time, something changed. The cost kept rising while the return kept shrinking. The appreciation disappeared, the respect disappeared, and the expectation became entitlement. What has now shocked so many observers is not that men are pulling back, but that they are doing it in such large numbers and with such finality. Chinese holidays, which were once massive spending events driven by men buying gifts, experiences, and status symbols for women, have seen a significant decline. This is not because men suddenly became poor or lazy, it is because they made a decision. They decided that the exchange no longer made sense. They decided that their labor, their money, and their energy were being drained without purpose. Online, this shift has become visible in uncomfortable ways. Women who once relied on this flow of spending are now publicly struggling, and instead of sympathy, they are being met with ridicule and disbelief. Many people are asking how someone can reach adulthood without the ability to pay basic bills or manage basic expenses. Others are asking why this responsibility was outsourced to men in the first place. And while these conversations are harsh, they expose something that was always fragile beneath the surface. The reality is that a large part of the so-called Simp economy functioned as a financial bridge between individual responsibility and social expectation. It allowed some women to live beyond their means because there was always someone else expected to cover the gap. When that bridge collapses, the fall is sudden and unforgiving. Rent does not care about social narratives. Food prices do not adjust based on past assumptions. Bills do not wait for sympathy. What makes this situation even more striking is how little regret men seem to have about stepping away. There is no mass campaign begging to return to the old system. There is no widespread apology tour. Instead, what we see is relief. We see men talking openly about peace, stability, and control over their own lives for the first time in years. We see men choosing solitude not as a punishment, but as a refuge. This is something many people did not expect because they were told men could not survive without validation, without relationships, and without constant pursuit. But the truth is that many men discovered something powerful when they stopped participating. They discovered that their stress levels dropped, their finances improved, their sense of self returned. When you remove the constant pressure to prove your worth through spending, you start to ask deeper questions about what you actually want. For many men, the answer was not more struggle, it was less noise. This is where the broader narrative becomes uncomfortable for society. For decades, men were criticized, corrected, and conditioned. They were told they were not doing enough, not earning enough, not giving enough. At the same time, they were told that their presence was unwanted unless it came with material value attached. Approaching was discouraged. Commitment was treated as optional. Responsibility was framed as oppressive when it came from men, but expected when it benefited others. And eventually, people reach a breaking point. And when that breaking point arrives quietly rather than violently, it is often ignored until the consequences can no longer be hidden. The decline in spending is not just about money, it is about withdrawal of participation. It is men saying that the contract they never agreed to has been canceled. What many women are now facing is not punishment, it is reality without a safety net they assumed would always exist. Jobs that once felt optional are now mandatory. Budgets that were once theoretical are now unavoidable. The state cannot fill this gap indefinitely, especially in an economy under strain. And the men who were once expected to step in are choosing not to. This has created a cultural shock. There is confusion about why appeals are not working anymore. There is disbelief that guilt is no longer effective. There is frustration that the old tools no longer produce the same results. But this reaction ignores a simple truth. You cannot spend decades telling people they are unnecessary and then be surprised when they leave. One of the most telling aspects of this situation is how quickly the narrative has tried to shift. Suddenly, the conversation is about cooperation again. Suddenly, there is talk of shared responsibility. Suddenly, there is concern about demographic decline and social stability. These are serious issues, but they ring hollow when they arrive only after one side has already checked out. Men are not refusing to participate because they hate women. They are refusing because participation came at the cost of their dignity, autonomy, and future. They were told to wait, to sacrifice, and to accept less while being promised a payoff that never materialized. Eventually, waiting becomes foolish rather than noble. What we are seeing in China is an accelerated version of a global pattern. The numbers are simply more visible. The response is more concentrated, but the underlying logic is the same everywhere. When incentives disappear, behavior changes. When costs outweigh benefits, participation drops. This is not bitterness, it is economics applied to human behavior. The mocking that has emerged online is not healthy, but it is revealing. It shows how little empathy existed in the other direction when men struggled. For years, male loneliness, burnout, and financial pressure were dismissed or minimized. Now that the pressure has shifted, the response is shock rather than understanding. That contrast tells us everything we need to know about how unbalanced the system had become. What is especially important to understand is that many of these men are not looking back. This is not a temporary protest, it is a reorientation of life priorities. Men are investing in their health, their finances, their skills, and their peace. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run, The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. They are building lives that do not depend on external approval. Once someone experiences that level of stability, it is very difficult to convince them to return to chaos. There is also a generational lesson here. Younger men are watching this unfold and drawing conclusions early. They are seeing the consequences and adjusting their expectations before they ever enter the system. This means the trend is likely to continue rather than reverse. When a generation learns through observation instead of pain, the shift becomes permanent. This does not mean cooperation between men and women is impossible. It means it cannot be built on exploitation, assumption, or one sided sacrifice. Any future model that works will have to be grounded in realism, mutual effort, and genuine respect. Those conditions cannot be forced, they must be chosen. For now, what exists is a gap between old expectations and new realities, a gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Men have chosen to step out of that gap rather than fall into it. And once that choice is made collectively, there is no easy way to reverse it. To really understand why this shift happened with such force, you have to step back and look at how incentives were structured over time and how expectations slowly detached from reality. In China, rapid economic growth created an illusion of endless upward mobility. For a while, it seemed like there would always be another opportunity, another raise, another apartment, another promotion. During that period, the cost of dating and relationships rose quietly, almost invisibly, because the overall system was expanding. When everyone believes tomorrow will be richer than today, excess feels manageable. Sacrifice feels temporary. Men were willing to give more because they believed they would eventually have more to give without feeling the loss. But economies do not expand forever. And when growth slows, reality asserts itself quickly. Housing prices surged beyond what most young men could reasonably afford. Work hours increased while job security weakened. Competition intensified and pressure mounted. Yet the expectations placed on men in relationships did not adjust downward. They continued to rise as if nothing had changed. That mismatch created stress, resentment, and fatigue that built quietly beneath the surface. Men were not just paying for dates, they were paying for an entire narrative that no longer matched their lived experience. At the same time, cultural messaging reinforced the idea that men who hesitated were inadequate. If you could not keep up, it was framed as a personal failure rather than a structural problem. This framing is powerful because it isolates individuals and prevents collective awareness. Each man believed he was alone in his exhaustion, alone in his frustration, and alone in his doubts. But when people started talking openly online, something unexpected happened. They realized they were not alone at all. The same stories repeated again and again, the same sacrifices, the same outcomes, the same disappointment. And this is when withdrawal becomes contagious. Once people see others stepping away and surviving, even thriving, the fear that kept them compliant weakens. Men began to realize that opting out did not lead to social collapse in their personal lives. Instead, it often led to stability. They paid off debts, they saved money, they slept better, they reclaimed time. And most importantly, they stopped feeling like their worth was measured solely by what they could provide to others. What makes this particularly difficult for society to address is that there is no single villain and no single solution. This is not a story of evil intent. It is a story of accumulated incentives that produce the predictable behavior. When one side is rewarded for demanding more and the other is punished for resisting, imbalance is inevitable. When resistance finally arrives, it looks sudden, only because the warning signs were ignored. The reaction from many women has followed a familiar pattern. First came disbelief, then came frustration, then came attempts to shame or guilt men back into participation. When that failed, there was a pivot toward victimhood, framing the situation as cruelty rather than consequence. But this framing collapses under scrutiny because it ignores agency. Adults are responsible for their choices. If a system depended on voluntary participation, it was always vulnerable to voluntary exit. One of the most revealing developments has been the language shift around independence. For years, independence was celebrated rhetorically, but outsourced practically. It sounded empowering, but it relied on an unspoken safety net. When that net vanished, independence suddenly felt heavier. True independence is not symbolic. It requires skills, planning, and resilience. It is not glamorous. It is quiet, disciplined, and often uncomfortable. Men recognized this earlier because they had little choice. Many were forced into self reliance by necessity. They learned how to manage money, how to live within limits, how to find meaning outside of approval. That learning curve was painful, but it produced strength. When men talk about peace and solitude, they are not describing isolation. They are describing freedom from constant evaluation. They are describing a life where effort leads to personal benefit rather than endless obligation. This is why attempts to lure men back with superficial appeals have largely failed. Promises without structural change do not work anymore. Compliments without respect do not work anymore. Narratives that frame men as resources rather than people are immediately rejected. Once awareness sets in, it cannot be undone with marketing. Another critical factor in the shift is technology. Social media did not create these dynamics, but it exposed them. Men could compare notes, they could see patterns, they could watch outcomes unfold in real time. This transparency removed the illusion that sacrifice guaranteed reward. It also exposed contradictions between what was said publicly and what was practiced privately. When people see hypocrisy clearly, trust erodes fast. In China, this erosion of trust intersected with demographic reality. There are more men than women in the younger population, which intensified competition and raised expectations even higher. This imbalance created a market dynamic where men were encouraged to bid against each other through spending. But markets collapse when buyers leave. No amount of moral pressure can sustain a system without willing participants. What many commentators fail to grasp is that this withdrawal is not fueled by hatred, it is fueled by exhaustion. Hatred is loud, exhaustion is quiet. When people are angry, they fight. When they are exhausted, they leave. That distinction matters because it explains why there is so little appetite for reconciliation without deep change. Men are not looking to argue, they are looking to rest. This has implications beyond dating and relationships. It affects consumption, housing, population growth, and social stability. When men disengage from traditional milestones, entire economic sectors feel the impact. Fewer weddings mean fewer purchases. Fewer families mean fewer long term investments. These ripple effects are already visible, and they challenge assumptions that were baked into policy planning. Yet instead of addressing root causes, many institutions focus on symptoms. They ask how to encourage spending without asking why spending stopped. They ask how to increase participation without asking why participation feels unrewarding. This approach is backwards. You cannot demand engagement from people who feel exploited. Engagement must be earned through fairness. There is also a psychological shift underway that deserves attention. Men are redefining success. For a long time, success was externally validated through status symbols, relationships, and visible achievement. Now, success is increasingly internal. It is measured by calm, control, and consistency. This redefinition undermines industries built on aspiration and comparison. If people stop chasing approval, many business models collapse. This is deeply unsettling for a society that relies on consumption driven by insecurity. When men no longer feel compelled to prove themselves through spending, The entire feedback loop breaks. That is why the response has been so frantic. It is not just about relationships, it is about economic momentum. Women who find themselves struggling now are often portrayed as casualties of cruelty, but that framing avoids uncomfortable questions. Why was reliance normalized? Why was planning discouraged? Why was sustainability ignored? These questions are not accusations. They are necessary reflections if anything is going to change. It is also important to note that not all women are affected equally. Those who invested in skills, careers, and realistic planning are far less vulnerable. The collapse hits hardest where dependency was highest. That distinction matters because it shows that this is not an inevitable outcome. It is a consequence of choices reinforced by culture. Men, for their part, are not immune to consequences either. Withdrawal comes with trade offs. Loneliness exists, isolation exists, but many men are choosing predictable loneliness over unpredictable exploitation. That choice says everything about how the old system was experienced. When solitude feels safer than participation, something fundamental has broken. As this pattern spreads, younger generations will internalize new norms, dating will become more cautious, expectations will be negotiated rather than assumed, financial independence will be prioritized earlier. These shifts will not be announced with slogans, they will emerge quietly through behavior. China is simply the most visible case because of scale and speed. But similar dynamics are appearing elsewhere, sometimes disguised under different labels. The core issue remains the same. When relationships become transactional in one direction only, trust erodes. When sacrifice is demanded without reciprocity, participation declines. There is also a moral dimension that is often ignored. Dignity matters. People can endure hardship when they feel respected. They cannot endure it indefinitely when they feel disposable. Men tolerated imbalance longer than many expected because they believed their role mattered. When that belief collapsed, so did their willingness to continue. What we are witnessing now is not the end of cooperation, it is the end of unexamined assumptions. Any future system that works will require honesty. It will require acknowledging mistakes without defensiveness. It will require treating people as partners rather than tools. But that future cannot be built by pretending the past was harmless. It cannot be built by demanding forgiveness without accountability. And it cannot be built by shaming people for protecting themselves. When participation fades quietly instead of exploding publicly, institutions struggle to respond because there is nothing obvious to confront. There are no protests to suppress, no slogans to counter, no leaders to negotiate with. There is only absence, fewer men showing up, fewer men spending, fewer men committing. Silence replaces engagement, and silence is difficult to manage because it offers no leverage. You cannot argue with someone who has already left the room. This is why traditional appeals to duty, tradition, or social obligation have failed so completely. Those appeals rely on emotional investment, and emotional investment is precisely what has been withdrawn. For decades, tradition was used selectively. Men were reminded of their responsibilities while being told that expectations placed on others were outdated or optional. Responsibility became asymmetrical. Over time, men noticed this imbalance not through ideology, but through lived experience. They worked, paid, planned, and postponed while watching standards shift in ways that always seemed to demand more from them and less from others. Eventually, the idea of tradition stopped feeling like shared values and started feeling like a one way contract. This is why calls to return to old norms ring hollow. You cannot selectively revive tradition only when it benefits one side. People are not confused about what is being asked of them. They are refusing because they understand it too well. The past is not being rejected out of ignorance, it is being rejected because its costs were paid without the promised returns. What replaces tradition in this vacuum is pragmatism. Men are making decisions based on outcomes rather than ideals. They are asking simple questions. Does this improve my life? Does this cost me more than it gives? Does this align with my long term stability? These questions are not hostile, they are rational. And once people start thinking this way, emotional pressure loses its power. One of the most uncomfortable realizations for society is that many men are discovering they were never truly valued for who they were, only for what they provided. When provision stops and interest disappears immediately, the lesson becomes impossible to ignore. This realization reshapes identity. Men stop tying their self worth to external validation and start anchoring it internally. That shift is irreversible once it happens. This internal anchoring is what makes reconciliation so difficult. You cannot entice someone back into dependency once they have learned independence. You cannot promise future appreciation to someone who learned to appreciate themselves. Any future cooperation must be built on equality rather than leverage, and that requires dismantling habits that were once normalized. There's also an important distinction between opting out and giving up. Men are not withdrawing because they have no options. They are withdrawing because they have discovered better ones. Better does not always mean easier. It means more predictable. It means more controllable. It means less emotionally volatile. That trade is appealing to anyone who has spent years navigating uncertainty with little reward. This is why so many men describe peace rather than triumph. There is no victory parade. There is no desire to dominate. There is simply relief. Relief from pressure. Relief from expectation. Relief from being told they are simultaneously essential and disposable. Peace is the reward for stepping away, and peace is difficult to surrender once achieved. As this mindset spreads, it alters social power dynamics in subtle ways. Power is not only about authority, it is about willingness. A system can demand compliance only as long as people are willing to comply. When willingness evaporates, power becomes performative rather than functional. Rules still exist, but enforcement weakens. Expectations remain, but fulfillment declines. This dynamic explains why so many discussions now feel disconnected from reality. Official narratives talk about participation as if it is guaranteed, while actual behavior shows the opposite. The gap between rhetoric and reality grows wider, creating confusion and frustration. But confusion does not reverse trends, only meaningful change does. There is also a generational acceleration happening beneath the surface. Younger men are entering adulthood already skeptical. They are watching older men opt out and avoid consequences they were warned about. This observational learning is powerful. It bypasses ideology and goes straight to outcome. When warnings do not come true, credibility collapses. At the same time, younger women are receiving mixed signals. They are told to be independent while still benefiting from support structures that assume male participation. When those structures weaken, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Independence without preparation is not empowerment, it is vulnerability disguised as confidence. This creates a moment of reckoning, not because anyone wants it, but because reality demands it. Economic pressure does not negotiate, time does not pause. Bills do not care about narratives. When systems built on assumption encounter constraint, they either adapt or break. What adaptation requires is honesty, honest accounting of who paid what, honest recognition of who benefited, honest reflection on what was sustainable and what was not. Without this honesty, attempts to rebuild trust will fail. People do not re enter systems that refuse to acknowledge past imbalance. Another overlooked aspect of this shift is how it reshapes masculinity itself. For a long time, masculinity was defined externally through performance, providing, pursuing, enduring. Now, masculinity is being redefined internally through boundaries, discernment, self respect. This redefinition does not need approval because it is self validating. This internal masculinity is less visible but more stable. It does not require applause. It does not collapse under criticism. And because it does not seek validation, it is resistant to manipulation. That resistance is what makes it threatening to systems built on guilt and obligation. Critics often frame this withdrawal as bitterness, but bitterness seeks confrontation. Withdrawal seeks distance. The absence of outrage is the clearest signal that something fundamental has shifted. When people stop arguing, it is usually because they have stopped caring about persuasion. This detachment has consequences for social cohesion. Cooperation becomes conditional rather than assumed. Trust becomes selective rather than universal. These changes are not inherently negative, but they require new frameworks. Old assumptions cannot simply be patched over. One of the reasons this is so hard to address is that there is no centralized authority to negotiate with. Men are not organized under a single banner. They are responding individually to shared conditions. That makes the movement resilient. You cannot dismantle it by targeting leaders or controlling messaging. It exists in personal decisions repeated millions of times. This decentralized withdrawal mirrors broader economic trends. Consumers opt out of overpriced markets. Workers opt out of exploitative jobs. Investors opt out of unsustainable models. In each case, the pattern is the same. When value disappears, participation follows. Relationships are not exempt from this logic. They are subject to the same cost benefit analysis, even if people pretend otherwise. When emotional and financial investment yields diminishing returns, rational actors adjust. That adjustment is not cruelty, it is adaptation. There is also an emotional honesty emerging among men that was previously discouraged. Admitting exhaustion was once seen as weakness, now it is seen as awareness. Naming imbalance was once taboo, now it is common. These shifts change the emotional landscape in ways that cannot be reversed by social pressure. What remains is a choice point. Societies can continue pretending this is a temporary phase, or they can confront the underlying causes honestly. They can either adapt expectations to reality or continue demanding participation from people who have already chosen distance. Reconciliation is possible, but it requires humility. It requires acknowledging that some demands were unreasonable. It requires rebuilding trust through action rather than words. It requires treating men as full participants with agency rather than resources to be managed. Without these changes, the trend will continue. Not dramatically, quietly, one decision at a time. One man choosing peace over pressure. One boundary replacing one obligation. One absence replacing one assumption. If there is going to be any kind of rebuilding after the shift, it cannot start with nostalgia. Nostalgia is comforting, but it is dishonest when it ignores cost. Too many conversations begin with what society wants men to return to, instead of asking why men left in the first place. That reversal of logic guarantees failure. People do not rejoin systems that refuse to examine their own design. They do not volunteer for roles that previously consumed them without reward. Any attempt to rebuild participation must begin with accountability, not persuasion. Accountability is uncomfortable because it requires admitting that certain narratives were incomplete or misleading. It requires admitting that encouragement turned into pressure and that empowerment rhetoric sometimes masked dependency. It also requires acknowledging that men were often told their discomfort was imaginary or selfish. When people are told repeatedly that their lived experience is invalid, they eventually stop sharing it. Silence becomes safer than honesty. That silence is what we are seeing now. One of the most damaging myths is the idea that men simply need better messaging. This assumes the problem is misunderstanding rather than experience. Men understand the message perfectly. They lived it. They acted on it. The results were not what they were promised. Changing the language without changing the structure is not reform, it is rebranding. And rebranding does not rebuild trust. Real reform would require symmetry. If responsibility is shared, then so are expectations. If independence is valued, then it must be practiced rather than outsourced. If partnership is the goal, then contribution must be mutual and visible. These principles sound obvious, but they were not applied consistently, which is why the system drifted so far from balance. Another hard truth is that some people benefited enormously from imbalance and have little incentive to admit it. When systems reward entitlement, entitlement defends itself aggressively. It reframes criticism as cruelty. It reframes boundaries as hostility. This deflection delays reform and accelerates collapse. You cannot correct a system while denying its outcomes. What makes this moment particularly fragile is that trust erodes faster than it rebuilds. Once people feel used, they do not easily accept reassurance. They look for proof, they look for patterns, they look for consistency over time. Men who stepped away are watching closely, even if they are not engaging. Silence does not mean ignorance, it means observation. This observation is shaping long term behavior. Men are increasingly cautious about commitments that cannot be exited without penalty. They are wary of obligations that escalate without consent. They are attentive to early warning signs that once would have been ignored. This caution is not paranoia, it is learned behavior. Once learned, it becomes instinct. There is also a shift in how men view sacrifice. Sacrifice used to be framed as virtue in itself. Now it is evaluated based on return. Sacrifice without reciprocity is no longer admired. It is seen as wasteful. This reframing alters moral incentives. People stop applauding self destruction and start valuing sustainability. This is why appeals to selflessness fall flat. Selflessness is meaningful only when it is chosen freely and reciprocated fairly. When it becomes expected or enforced socially, it loses moral weight. Men are not rejecting generosity, they are rejecting obligation without appreciation. Another factor shaping this landscape is the decline of institutional credibility. When institutions fail to protect individuals who follow the rules, compliance drops. Men who did what they were told and still ended up depleted are less likely to trust future guidance. This skepticism is rational. It is based on evidence rather than ideology. As skepticism grows, people rely more on peer experience than official narratives. They listen to those who stepped away and survived. They watch outcomes rather than promises. This peer based learning is powerful because it is grounded in reality. It spreads quietly and resists censorship because it does not depend on centralized messaging. This decentralization makes the trend durable. Even if public conversation shifts, private decisions remain unchanged. Men may stop talking about withdrawal, but they will continue practicing it. Behavior lags conversation, and reversal requires sustained proof, not temporary campaigns. There is also an emotional recalibration happening that deserves attention. Men are allowing themselves to feel content without external validation. This is subtle but profound. Contentment without approval breaks the cycle of performance. It reduces vulnerability to manipulation. It allows people to define success on their own terms. This internal contentment is often mistaken for apathy. It is not apathy, it is discernment. Men are choosing where to invest their limited energy. They are prioritizing stability over drama. That choice does not announce itself loudly, but it reshapes lives steadily. As more men adopt this mindset, social expectations adjust whether anyone approves or not. Dating becomes more selective. Financial boundaries become firmer. Time becomes more guarded. These changes reduce availability, which forces recalibration elsewhere. Systems adapt when inputs change. The challenge for society is that adaptation requires letting go of assumptions that once felt permanent. It requires accepting that some roles will no longer be filled automatically. It requires adjusting policy, culture, and expectations to align with actual behavior rather than idealized models. Resistance to this adjustment is understandable. Change threatens comfort. But resisting reality only prolongs instability. The sooner imbalance is acknowledged, the sooner sustainable alternatives can emerge. It is also important to recognize that men walking away does not mean men withdrawing from life. They are not disappearing, they are redirecting. They are building careers, friendships, skills, and routines that do not revolve around approval seeking. They are contributing in ways that feel voluntary rather than coerced. This redirection may ultimately produce healthier individuals, but it challenges systems that relied on unexamined participation. That challenge is not malicious, it is evolutionary. Systems that adapt survive, systems that cling to outdated assumptions fade. There is no simple solution because there is no single cause, but there are principles that can guide reform: transparency, reciprocity, respect. These are not slogans, they are practices. Without them, no amount of messaging will restore trust. As we move forward, the question is not whether men will return to old patterns. They will not. The question is whether new patterns can emerge that are fair enough to invite participation willingly. That invitation must be earned. When people talk about cooperation in this new environment, they often imagine a return to balance without acknowledging how balance was lost. Cooperation cannot be rebuilt on expectation alone. It must be grounded in clearly defined boundaries and shared responsibility. That means moving away from vague ideas of what someone should do and toward concrete agreements about what each person is willing to contribute. Without that clarity, mistrust fills the gaps and participation remains low. One of the biggest obstacles to rebuilding cooperation is the belief that compromise means loss. For years, compromise was framed as something men were expected to make quietly, while others retained flexibility. Over time, that dynamic taught men that compromise was not mutual. It was a one way adjustment. In the current climate, any proposal that resembles that pattern is immediately rejected. Men are not interested in negotiations where the outcome is predetermined. This creates tension because many social scripts were built around implicit understanding rather than explicit agreement. Those scripts assumed compliance rather than consent. When consent is withdrawn, the script collapses. Writing a new script requires effort from everyone involved, not just those who previously benefited from the old one. Another factor shaping this moment is the role of time. Men who stepped away often did so after years of accumulated disappointment. They did not arrive at this decision impulsively. They arrived through repetition. Each unmet expectation reinforced the next. By the time withdrawal occurred, it was already emotionally settled. That means reversal requires not just incentive, but repair. Repair is difficult because it requires acknowledging harm without defensiveness. It requires listening without immediately correcting. It requires accepting that good intentions do not erase negative outcomes. Many attempts at dialogue fail because they rush to justification rather than understanding. Men hear explanations where they are seeking recognition. Without recognition, explanations feel hollow. There is also a mismatch between urgency and patience. Institutions often want quick fixes. Individuals who are burned need time: time to observe consistency, time to test boundaries, time to rebuild trust gradually. That timeline does not align with policy cycles or media narratives, which is why surface level solutions dominate discussion. Another uncomfortable reality is that some men will never return, regardless of reform. Once someone has rebuilt their life around autonomy and stability, the cost of reentry may simply be too high. That does not mean reform is pointless. It means expectations must be realistic. Participation may increase slowly, selectively, and conditionally rather than universally. This selective participation changes social dynamics in subtle ways. Standards become negotiated rather than assumed. People who want engagement must demonstrate value rather than rely on entitlement. This is not dehumanizing, it is clarifying. When expectations are explicit, resentment has less room to grow. There is also a cultural recalibration happening around respect. Respect is no longer tied to performance alone. It is tied to boundaries being honored. Men are paying close attention to how disagreement is handled. Are concerns dismissed or addressed? Are limits respected or challenged? These signals matter more than promises. As this recalibration unfolds, it exposes the difference between equality and sameness. Equality does not mean identical roles or contributions, it means fairness and expectation and appreciation. It means acknowledging different capacities without assigning default obligation. That distinction was often lost in previous narratives, leading to confusion and conflict. Another layer to this situation is economic reality. Many men stepped away, not only because of emotional fatigue, but because the math stopped working. When housing, healthcare, and basic living costs rise faster than income, discretionary spending disappears. Romantic narratives cannot override financial constraint. Ignoring this reality alienates people who are already struggling. Economic pressure also reveals priorities. Men are choosing to secure their future rather than subsidize present expectations. This choice is framed by some as selfish, but self preservation is not selfish, it is necessary. People who do not protect their future eventually become dependent themselves, which helps no one. This brings us to the role of planning. For years, planning was treated as optional for some and mandatory for others. That asymmetry created vulnerability. Now, planning is becoming non negotiable across the board. People who adapt will be more resilient. People who resist will face harsher adjustments. One reason this adjustment feels so abrupt is because warning signs were ignored. Declining marriage rates, falling birth rates, rising loneliness. These trends were discussed academically, but rarely addressed practically. When consequences arrive, they feel sudden, but they were years in the making. The current moment is not defined by conflict, it is defined by recalculation. Men are recalculating risk, they are recalculating reward, they are recalculating identity. This recalculation is quiet, methodical, and personal. It does not require approval, it does not seek permission. As recalculation spreads, it challenges narratives that depend on predictability. When behavior becomes unpredictable, systems built on assumption wobble. This wobble is often interpreted as instability, but it is actually adaptation in progress. New equilibria take time to form. Another important element is the shift from scarcity thinking to sufficiency thinking among men. Instead of chasing more at any cost, many are choosing enough, enough income, enough peace, enough connection. This sufficiency mindset reduces vulnerability to pressure and reduces appetite for excess. This mindset also reshapes relationships. Connections are evaluated based on quality rather than quantity. Men are less willing to tolerate inconsistency, disrespect, or imbalance. This selectivity may reduce overall participation, but it increases satisfaction among those who do engage. Critics argue that this selectivity creates distance, but distance is not inherently harmful. Distance can create space for reflection, it can prevent harm, it can allow healthier patterns to emerge. Proximity without respect is far more damaging than distance with clarity. What is missing from many discussions is the acknowledgement that men learned these lessons the hard way. They did not wake up one day and decide to withdraw. They endured. They tried. They adjusted. Withdrawal was the last option, not the first. This matters because it reframes the narrative. Men are not rejecting cooperation out of fear or hostility. They are rejecting systems that failed them repeatedly. That distinction is crucial if any future cooperation is to be meaningful. As society grapples with these changes, there will be pressure to assign blame. Blame is easier than responsibility, but blame does not rebuild trust. Responsibility does. Responsibility begins with asking hard questions about incentive structures and cultural norms. The most productive conversations will not be about forcing men back into old roles. They will be about creating new frameworks that make participation worthwhile. Worthwhile not in theory, but in practice. Media narratives play a powerful role in shaping how this shift is perceived, and in many cases, they have done more to obscure reality than illuminate it. Simplified stories are easier to sell than complex truths, so what often appears is a caricature rather than an explanation. Men who withdraw are labeled as disengaged or unmotivated, while the deeper causes are glossed over or ignored entirely. This framing reassures audiences that nothing fundamental has changed, that the issue lies with individual attitude rather than systemic imbalance. But reassurance built on denial cannot last. Eventually, behavior contradicts narrative, and when that happens, trust in media erodes alongside trust in institutions. One of the most common distortions is the idea that this withdrawal is driven by online influence rather than lived experience. This explanation is comforting because it implies that removing content or discouraging discussion will reverse the trend. But influence does not create exhaustion, it amplifies what already exists. Men did not arrive at these conclusions because someone told them to. They arrived because the patterns in their lives repeated until the lesson became undeniable. Online discussion simply gave language to what was already felt. Another distortion is the insistence that men are reacting to short term discomfort rather than long term imbalance. This minimizes the depth of the issue and frames withdrawal as impulsive. In reality, most men who step away do so after sustained effort. They try to adapt, they try to meet expectations, they try to negotiate. Withdrawal comes when adaptation no longer works. That timeline matters because it reveals intent. This is not avoidance, it is boundary setting after repeated overextension. Media also tends to personalize what is structural. Individual stories are highlighted while patterns are ignored. This keeps discussion fragmented and prevents recognition of scale. When millions of people make similar decisions independently, the cause is rarely personal failure, it is environmental pressure. Ignoring that pressure does not make it disappear, it simply ensures it will express itself in more disruptive ways later. There is also a tendency to frame men's withdrawal as a rejection of connection itself. This is misleading. Men are not rejecting connection, they are rejecting imbalance. Many still seek companionship, but on terms that do not require self erosion. They are willing to engage where effort is mutual and respect is consistent. What they refuse is participation in systems that treat their contribution as automatic and their needs as optional. This distinction is crucial because it points toward a path forward. Connection is still possible, but it must be built differently. It must be negotiated rather than assumed. It must be grounded in realism rather than fantasy. Media narratives that ignore this nuance delay adaptation by clinging to outdated models. Another area where narrative fails is in its treatment of responsibility. Responsibility is often framed as burden rather than agency. Men are told they are avoiding responsibility when they withdraw, but what they are often avoiding is obligation without authority. Responsibility without control is not empowerment, it is exposure. Men are increasingly unwilling to accept responsibility for outcomes they cannot influence. This is not irresponsibility, it is rational risk management. Now, when people are blamed for opting out of systems that no longer serve them, it reveals a deeper expectation that participation is owed rather than earned. That expectation is the root of the problem. Participation that is assumed breeds resentment. Participation that is invited breeds engagement. The difference lies in respect. Another overlooked aspect is how silence is misinterpreted. Men who withdraw often stop explaining themselves because explanation invites debate rather than understanding. When explanation is met with dismissal, silence becomes efficient. That silence is then misread as indifference or hostility when it is actually a protective measure. People conserve energy when they believe it will not be valued. This dynamic feeds a cycle of misunderstanding. Silence is interpreted negatively. Negative interpretation justifies further dismissal. Dismissal reinforces silence. Breaking this cycle requires a willingness to listen without immediate rebuttal. That willingness has been rare, which is why silence persists. There's also a generational dimension to media portrayal. Younger men are often depicted as lost or unmotivated, while older men are depicted as bitter. Both portrayals miss the common thread, which is recalibration. Across age groups, men are reassessing what they give and why. The specifics differ, but the logic is shared. When outcomes do not match effort, adjustment follows. This recalibration is not unique to relationships. It mirrors trends in work, consumption, and lifestyle. People are leaving jobs that demand loyalty without security. They are leaving markets that overcharge without delivering value. They are leaving communities that demand conformity without offering belonging. These exits are connected by a common principle. Participation must make sense. What makes the situation tense is that many systems were built on inertia rather than consent. They functioned because people did not believe they could leave. Once leaving became imaginable, everything changed. Imagination precedes action. When people see alternatives, even imperfect ones, the grip of obligation weakens. This is why attempts to shame men back into participation have backfired. Shame works only when people value the judgment of those applying it. Men who have withdrawn no longer seek that validation. Their self assessment comes from internal metrics rather than external approval. Without leverage, shame loses effectiveness. And so another misstep in public discussion is the assumption that financial independence alone resolves these tensions. While economic stability matters, it does not address respect. Men with resources are often the first to withdraw because they have the means to do so. Their withdrawal demonstrates that the issue is not poverty, but principle. When people with options choose distance, it signals deeper dissatisfaction. This leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. If participation cannot be bought, it must be earned. Earning participation requires fairness, predictability, and appreciation. These qualities cannot be simulated, they must be practiced consistently. As narratives struggle to keep up with reality, a gap forms between what is said and what is done. People nod along publicly while disengaging privately. This gap is dangerous because it creates the illusion of stability while erosion continues underneath. By the time collapse is acknowledged, rebuilding becomes harder. The solution is not louder messaging, it is quieter listening. It is observing behavior and adjusting accordingly. It is accepting that some roles are no longer viable and must be redesigned. Clinging to the past delays the future. Men are not asking for dominance or privilege, they are asking for fairness. They are asking that effort be met with effort. They are asking that boundaries be respected. These are modest requests, but they challenge systems that benefited from ambiguity. If current trends continue without meaningful adaptation, the long term outcomes will not arrive as a single dramatic event. They will unfold quietly through absence rather than conflict, fewer families forming, fewer shared milestones, fewer men stepping into roles that once felt automatic. This is how social change usually happens, not with declarations, but with patterns that harden over time. Once hardened, they are difficult to soften again. One of the risks of ignoring this shift is that distance becomes normalized. When enough people disengage, detachment stops feeling temporary and starts feeling permanent. New generations grow up without ever experiencing the old assumptions, which means appeals to return will sound foreign rather than familiar. What was once framed as a crisis response becomes the default mode of life. This normalization changes expectations across the board. Men do not expect partnership by default. Women do not expect provision by default. Institutions cannot assume participation by default. Everything becomes conditional. Conditional systems can work, but they require clarity. They require effort. They require accountability. Without those, fragmentation increases. Fragmentation does not mean collapse, but it does mean inefficiency. Social trust declines. Cooperation becomes harder. People retreat into smaller, more controlled circles. These circles offer safety but limit scale. Large projects struggle. Long term planning weakens. The cost of rebuilding cohesion rises. At the same time, there is opportunity hidden within this disruption. When outdated expectations fall away, space opens for more honest arrangements. Relationships can be built on explicit agreement rather than assumption. Contribution can be negotiated rather than imposed. Respect can be demonstrated rather than demanded. These changes are difficult, but they are healthier. The key question is whether societies are willing to learn before damage becomes irreversible. Learning requires humility. It requires admitting that some narratives were wrong or incomplete. It requires acknowledging that good intentions do not guarantee good outcomes. Without this humility, systems repeat mistakes until participation evaporates entirely. Men who have walked away are not waiting to be convinced. They are watching whether words turn into behavior, watching whether boundaries are respected consistently, watching whether accountability replaces blame. Reentry, if it happens, will be slow and selective. It will not be driven by guilt or nostalgia. It will be driven by trust. Trust cannot be demanded. It is earned through consistency over time. That means fewer grand statements and more quiet changes. It means fewer appeals to emotion and more alignment between expectation and reality. It means recognizing that people stay where they feel valued, not where they are needed. One of the most important lessons in all of this is that participation is not guaranteed by biology, tradition, or history. It is granted by choice and sadista. When that choice is taken for granted, withdrawal follows. This is not rebellion. It is self correction. Men did not suddenly decide to prioritize themselves. They did so after years of being told their needs were secondary. They did so after discovering that sacrifice without reciprocity leads to depletion. They did so after realizing that peace was possible outside of systems that thrived on pressure. That peace is not flashy, it does not trend online, it does not demand recognition. But it is powerful because it is sustainable. People protect what gives them stability. Once stability is found, risking it requires compelling reason. For women and institutions facing this new reality, the path forward is not to shame or mock or dismiss. It is to adapt. Adaptation does not mean surrender. It means realism. It means meeting people where they are rather than where they were expected to be. It means building systems that people want to join rather than feel trapped inside. This applies to relationships, workplaces, communities, and culture itself. Participation rises when people feel safe, respected, and fairly treated. It falls when they feel exploited or ignored. This is not ideology, it is human behavior. There will always be people who resist this conclusion because it challenges comfort. Comfort thrives on predictability, but predictability built on imbalance eventually fails. When it does, the choice is not between returning to the past or accepting chaos. The choice is between honest rebuilding and prolonged decline. Honest rebuilding requires difficult conversations. It requires letting go of narratives that protected ego at the expense of truth. It requires acknowledging that walking away was a rational response, not a moral failing. Without that acknowledgement, reconciliation remains superficial. Men walking away is not a threat, it is feedback. Feedback that was delivered quietly because loud feedback was ignored. The longer that feedback is dismissed, the more entrenched withdrawal becomes. What happens next depends on whether that feedback is finally heard. Before we end this video, I want to know what you think about everything we discussed. Do you agree with this analysis? Do you see similar patterns playing out where you live? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts because open discussion is the only way these issues are ever addressed honestly. And with that, like the video if you like it, don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.